Hello, I'm Dr. David Kanan with San Diego State University, and this is the lecture for Instruments of Public Policy. That's Module 2 in Part 1 for PA 460, Administration and Public Policy Development. The first thing we're going to speak about is Lowy's policy typology. So obviously there's several different types of policy that can be administered by government. And this is a very simplistic list that the text uses, which has 3 different categories. Lowy actually had 4, and the 4th would be called constituent policies, but we're not going to cover that in this course. We're just covering, like the text, the 3, which are distributive policies, redistributive policies, and regulatory policies. So the thing to get from this is distributive policies are policy actions that benefit or are accessible to most of the people. They say all of the people, but there's always going to be exceptions, so I prefer to use the term most. The examples include college research grants, national defense, obviously it's protecting everyone. Agricultural subsidies, yes, they go to farmers, but we all benefit because we eat the food that is produced. And of course, infrastructure. And if you see to the right, you have the National Science Foundation logo, and they give out billions of dollars each year that go to anywhere between 7,000 and 10,000 different research projects. The second of Lowy's policy typology is redistributive policies. Now, these are policy actions that benefit or are accessible to only some groups of people. And some would say there's winners and losers here. Often they're more controversial, and that being because they're only benefiting one group. Redistributive policies can vary quite a bit. Some examples include welfare policies, and we have the logo for the SNAP, which is formerly the food stamps program, to affirmative action policies and tax policies. A redistributive tax policy would be something like the wealth tax that was put in the previous administration to help pay for the Affordable Care Act. So those making lots of money, those who are very wealthy with very high incomes paid an extra percentage tax, and that tax went to pay for some of the benefits for those who did not have a lot of income or wealth to receive health care benefits. That wealth tax was removed in the current administration. And this happens back and forth. Regulatory policies are self-explanatory, and that's a government restriction of an individual choice to keep conduct from transcending acceptable bounds. So there's 2 types of regulatory policies. First, you have competitive regulation policy. And what that's designed to do is to prevent monopolies and other antitrust actions. And the goal of this is to make sure that competition is preserved in a market economy in order to theoretically provide the best product and services for the public. You also have policies associated with net neutrality, so therefore making the internet open to everyone rather than controlled or manipulated by certain entities that have more power. And finally, competitive regulation, you have the stock market and insider trading concerns, etc. And so you'll have something like the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is monitoring the competitive regulation in that market specifically. The other type of regulatory policies are protective or social regulation, and that's usually what we think of when we think of regulation. So that includes consumer protection, workplace health, safety, environmental regulation. That's where you see the Consumer Product Safety Commission come in. OSHA, we've all had to work and look at different OSHA regulations posted in the wall. And that's generally designed to protect people. So these are the types of policies. And now we're going to look at the actual instruments of public policy. Now, as you noticed in the module, and I'm reiterating here, for the purposes of this course, I've combined two different lists from the text. One is in chapter 3 and the other is in chapter 5. And that would be figure 3.1, which they call the instruments of public policy, and figure 5.2, what governments can do. And the reason I'm doing that is just to put them all in together as 10 separate categories. And this will make our work later on the group project easier, so I can refer to instruments of public policy, and you will know that there's these 10 different things that government essentially can do. One thing you're going to notice when I go through this list is many of these categories will overlap with other categories. And I'll give you examples of each as I go through it. That being the case, when you're doing the exercise for this module, try to use whatever example that you have to match with the instrument of public policy, the one that makes the most sense, that is the most descriptive and exclusive to that specific instrument. So we'll start with charging fees, and this is a very basic policy action, and we all see it when we go to, in our case, in the state of California, the DMV, and have to pay for a license or a license plate, etc. These fees are designed to help pay for the products. Another example would be your water bill. Now, not every city has city-controlled water. Some it could be at the county level, some could be a private water provider. But for those that are provided by the city, which was the more traditional way to do it, that is an example. And generally what you're doing is charging enough, essentially, theoretically, to cover the costs of providing that service or to provide most of that service. College tuition is a major one now, though there's quite a lot of subsidies and other things involved with college tuition. Public trust is the second instrument of public policy. And this one we see when we're going to Yosemite National Park or Yellowstone, or to the city park or county parks. This is holding a public property or public good in trust for citizens, generally indefinitely, not always, but generally. The third instrument of public policy is what we think about when we think of government run or a public good, pure public good, and that's government management. So government management means the production, delivery, management, everything associated with the product or service is directly controlled by government and offered to the citizens, or to the population rather. And examples, of course, are schools. This would be public schools, of course, police, national defense at the local level would be a city police or the county police, infrastructure projects, but infrastructure projects that are limited to local, state, or federal projects that do not include public-private partnerships, which we'll talk about later, which are generally toll roads or bridges. However, there are some public projects that have tolls as well and that are not associated with a private contractor. As we see just in this example, you're going to see some overlap. So when we talked about the DMV for charging fees, you're also going to see that the DMV is government management in the state of California. It's not working, it's not privatized, and it's not working with private sector. You're also going to see the same thing with Yosemite National Park and many national parks. They are going to be government management. They're run by the government. You will see small exceptions in some consulting and contracting out work on parks, but not always. The example I have for infrastructure is the Eisenhower Interstate System, and that was put forth in the 1950s and created the interstates all over the United States and really started to reshape our nation, and how we shape our cities and regional areas was greatly affected by those highways. So number 4, information, education, and research. And we talked about a distributive policy, and this would be one. And These could be public awareness campaigns, could be labeling on products that we get at the grocery store. It could be other campaigns to encourage positive behavior, stop smoking, etc., as well as research, educational resources, research centers, and grants for research to either universities or to private research institutions. And the example to the right, of course, is the CDC, which at this moment we're hearing a lot about. National Institute of Health is another. OSHA is another, and that's, public safety and regulation, but it's also information, education, and research. They provide a lot of that. The next item is market mechanisms. And market mechanisms could be a combination of several instruments of public policy. But basically, a market mechanism is creating an incentive in the market that encourages certain behaviors or to correct problems. So an example is we had renewable energy discounts to encourage green energy use. For example, if one bought a Tesla car, a few years ago, you would get $7,500 to write off your, as a tax credit. A major market mechanism is a mortgage tax deduction. And this is to encourage home ownership. And we see the diagram below. You have just a very simplistic example, $200,000 house, 4% mortgage interest rate, $8,000 interest paid the first year, and then you get 25%, so $2,000 tax credit. So the incentive here is to have people buying homes. The idea was that this was a way for the transfer of wealth to the masses as they accrue wealth through the ownership of a home. Another major market mechanism that changed the fabric of society was the GI Bill, and that was after World War II, and this allowed for the millions of those who served in World War II, who came back to either go to college or buy a home with some assistance to help build the middle class that we've grown accustomed to over the last 60, 70 years. So these things are very common and sometimes can be very effective. What's very popular now is public-private partnerships. And what that is the public sector is cooperating with the private sector to produce a good or service. And this can be done in several different ways. One is just doing contracting out in the most simplistic way with a private business for supplies or services, such as having a plumbing business come to a school and maintain the pipes for a public school, on a 5-year contract or something like that. Another is at the opposite end of the spectrum, essentially, is the privatization, and that's where you're transferring public services to the private sector entirely. This can happen at the local level. We see it with the privatization of waste management. And so you'll have several very large corporations come in and they basically take over the waste management for a city or county, and they can do whatever they wish within the law and regulation with what they collect. A popular example right now at San Diego State University is the Mission Valley project, which is creating an additional campus farther east down Interstate 8, next to where the Charger Stadium, football stadium was for many years. And this offers the opportunity for San Diego State University, which is a state university and part of the Cal State network, to build a very large project without having to provide all of the capital or most of the capital. In this case, it's a small minority of the capital. I'll go over that in just a second. So if we look at Mission Valley campus, this is something that San Diego State couldn't have done on their own. And what they have is they're creating a transit center that hooks up to the what they call the trolley system, which is a light rail transit throughout the city and county. And they also have a river park, and that's going to be coordinated with the city and county. So it's not always with a private sector entity. A P3 could be with 2 public entities. You have 4,600 housing units, of which 10% is set aside for affordable housing, which unfortunately, reading it now, they've been going back and forth on this. It looks like that's going to include student housing. So that raised a lot of question marks, as these are private developers building these housing units, and there's going to be a high incentive for them to make as much money as they can. And with this large development in the center of a very, very expensive and popular place to live, how are they going to keep the cost of housing down to where the students, and speaking for myself, the faculty will be able to afford? And that's probably going to be very difficult to do. The 10% affordable housing will be somewhat helpful, but if that's including students, the majority is going to go to that. Also, you have a 400-room hotel convention center. That's obviously a private development. 95,000 square feet of retail space. It's all private development. You have private development, tech, and lab space. And in the end, $300 million is being invested by SDSU to build this new campus of a total project budget of $3 billion. So you see the incentive for the university, they get excited that they can have $3 billion worth of stuff that they can, that's accessible, but you're going to have other externalities, and we talked about this in the first module, some negative externalities with the building of all of this housing. How are you going to be able to keep the prices affordable for those it's intended? And that's going to be extremely difficult. So this number 7 is rationing, and that's limiting access to scarce resources. In a lot of cases, it's limiting access to pure public goods. And the example, we have a recent example, and that's limiting access to personal protective equipment initially during the pandemic, because we just didn't have much in stock. And now that's changed. More common, you have requiring backpacking permits in a national park due to keep the numbers of people going into sensitive habitats limited. Very common, you'll have fishing or hunting limits just to maintain sustainability for those natural resources. Number 8 is regulation, and this is a very broad term. And but as we discussed before, when we're talking about the regulatory type of policy, these are government decrees that either require or prevent actions through laws or bureaucratic rules enforced by the executive branch. And we see that the local, state, and federal level, licensing, inspections, enforcement of standards, application of sanctions. At the federal level, you have the alphabet soup that I put together down here, but many very large regulatory agencies, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, the SEC, FCC, USDA, FDA, and many, many more. And subsidies generally are going to be market mechanisms. I'm sure there's some examples where there are not, but generally that's going to be the case. I wanted to have it as a separate category because it is a specific way to provide a market mechanism. So we're going to consider it separate, but understand that it is a market mechanism. So subsidies are loans or guaranteeing loans or direct payments that encourage a certain behavior. There's lots of examples of these. I know I have a lot of guaranteed student loans. I received a stimulus check, many of us did. Loans and direct payments to farmers, this is part of the Farm Bill, and that's to encourage sustainability, so they'll be paid to either not grow or grow certain crops, etc. Some may argue, well, if we're looking at that because it was listed as a distributive policy, type of policy, well, it's just benefiting them. But again, this benefits all of us, and we see it in the grocery store for the price of a lot of produce, as well as bread and corn-related products are very inexpensive in the United States due to these subsidies. Recently, we see the PPP loans, not to be confused with P3, though it does use a P3 element, and I'll explain that. But that's the Paycheck Protection Program. We see the diagram on the left. And basically, this was set up as the pandemic started. You have a lot of businesses that couldn't have customers due to social distancing and due to quarantine, etc. So this was set up to protect jobs essentially. And as you see, this can go, they can get a loan, it's very low, fixed 1% annual percentage rate, which is extremely low. And you can get up to 2.5 times your average monthly payroll. It can go towards payroll, rent, utilities, many other things. The first 6 months, there's no payments. This was set up when we all thought, oh, in 6 months this would all be over, but here we are now. And there's a total 2-year term that may be extended in future versions of the Paycheck Protection Program. And a main benefit of this is forgiveness up to 100%, provided the business that gets these loans keeps 3/4 of their staff on salary at, I believe, 3/4 of what their salary generally is. So this is designed to have people not panic and fire all these workers when they're closed down, but to be able to sustain this pandemic period, and most likely have to be extended further. Now, how I said before that this is also a P3, and it's a P3 because these loans actually, similar to the guaranteed student loans, the money is not coming from the government directly, it's going through banks. So these banks will get a subsidized agreement from the government. That means they will back these loans in case the individual or the company does not pay them back. And that's a very good risk for these loan companies. And so they're more apt to give these loans out. And that is very common. And this way you don't have a lot of money that has to come out of the system right away from the federal government. Though probably in the long run, they will have to pay for quite a few. So finally, we have taxing and spending. And the way I've set it up in this course is a bit different than maybe the text will give you the impression. And the reason I do it this way is because in the past, a lot of people would say, well, it's taxing and spending when I'm asking them what type of instrument of public policy something is. And the rationale would be, well, because taxes pay for it. Well, if that were the case, then all of everything would be taxing and spending to some degree, not everything, but most everything. So I like to differentiate taxing and spending for this course means that there's a special tax that's devoted exclusively for the policy action. So we have an example of that with the FICA tax, because there's 2 taxes built into the FICA tax that are specifically for a policy action. One is Social Security and one is Medicare. So these are also called the payroll taxes. And this is set up so that for example, Social Security, 6.2% comes from your employer, 6.2% comes from the employee, and together the 12.4% goes toward Social Security to fund the Social Security fund. In the same manner, Medicare, you have 1.45% from the employee and from the employer going into the Medicare fund to pay for that. There are sustainability issues with Social Security and Medicare. There's a chance that those numbers may have to go up, as well as other changes made to the programs so that they're sustainable. The reason being is that when these 2 programs were put forth many decades ago, you had a lot more workers to each senior citizen who would take advantage of the program. Now people live longer, so there's more seniors, and there's less workers per senior. So that's created some issues with sustainability. Often though, it's not as bad as what may be in the political dialogue, depending on which side of the aisle one is on. You have limits with the FICA tax for Social Security. Those making over $137,700, they won't be taxed anymore. So you're going to be taxed 6.2% up to that amount. and your employer the same. The matching will be the same. For Medicare, it's a little bit different. The percentage goes down, goes to 0.9%. So those things could also be modified in order to help with sustainability for these programs. So that's taxing and spending. Again, taxing and spending means you're creating a special tax that specifically goes to a program, something that may happen in the future. There's been discussion, and some states are starting to look into this. Oregon is one, and that is having a percentage tax added for a certain period of time, either 20 years, 30 years, that would pay for one's education. So if they go to a state school and their education would be paid for, but they would be paying a percentage of tax, 1%, 2%, for a certain 10, 20, 30 years in order to pay back the state for that education. So this is popular in some fronts. A benefit of this might be that people are concerned if they're going into teaching, like myself now, versus the private sector where one can make 2-3 times the amount of money, that this gives some incentive for those going into teaching and the lower paying jobs, that they're not having to pay the same amount as someone who's making a lot of money with the same degree who paid the same tuition. So this kind of evens out, and it is a redistributive way of paying for college that still protects some of these lower paying but very vital positions and careers. So finally, I wanted to go over this before I end this lecture, and it's not related to instruments of public policy, but there's 2 models. There's one in chapter 3, and that's the policy process model, or the policy cycle. And in chapter 4, there's the policy analysis process. Now, upon close reading of both, you will see that they are different, but I just wanted to make sure everyone knows the difference between the 2, because you'll have to know the differences as well as what the steps are for the exam. So the goal of the policy process model, that's in chapter 3, the policy cycle, it's describing the steps in the creation, implementation, and evaluation of a policy measure within the political process. So simply passing a law and implementing a policy. So it's very practical. This is how it gets on the agenda. The formulation, which the policy formulation in itself could be the policy analysis process, the chapter 4 steps all together in there. But then you have policy legitimation. That means that something has to become a law, has to be accepted by government and the people. The implementation, the evaluation, and policy change. If we're looking at the policy analysis process, and that's in the next chapter, which you're doing in the part 2 of this module, this is describing the steps to empirically evaluate the pros and cons of policy alternatives that address a policy issue. Simply, how to choose the best policy action, or how to weigh each policy action on its pluses and minuses, pros and cons. So that's the difference between these 2. In the past, teaching this course, there's been some confusion because the names are quite similar. But make sure to know the difference between those 2. Well, thank you, and good luck on the exercise and the discussion and your chapter reading quizzes, and I'll be back next module.